Welcome to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. Today is Friday, April 18th, day 559 of the war. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with the environmental reporter, Sue Surkes, stepping in for Laser Behrman, who should be back next week. Sue, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure, Amanda.
This is a week of spring holidays, and so we thought to dedicate the program to something very different from our diplomacy and politics and IDF and military. And we are going to talk about the biblical flora of the land of Israel. So especially, we're going to drill into some of those who have a resurrection theme for our Christian brothers and sisters who are celebrating Easter this week. So we're going to talk about the revival of an ancient date palm, the Rose of Jericho, and much, much more when we're back. In 2008, Dr. Elaine Solowey successfully germinated a 1,900-year-old date palm seed that she named, or others named, Methuselah, after the long-lived biblical character. She has since gone on to germinate several more date palm seeds, ancient and other species entirely. But Sue, take us back to this remarkable evolution of a date palm seed from almost 2,000 years ago that today is actually bearing fruit.
So Methuselah, which was the first seed that she managed to germinate, actually came from Masada. It was found by Dr. Sarah Salon, who's a medical doctor and runs a natural medicine unit at Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem. And Elaine, amazingly, was able to germinate this seed, which had laid dormant for 1,900 years. And she grew it on, and then she discovered that it was a male, and obviously males don't give fruits. So she then took a load more and managed to germinate them and ended up with some males and some females. And they're all actually growing in the Keturah kibbutz in the Arava in southern Israel. And it's thought to be the original Judean date palm. Most of the palms that we see in groves in Israel were actually smuggled in the early part of last century from Iraq and Morocco, such as the Majul date, which is one of the most popular. But the assumption is that this Methuselah and his brothers and sisters, or offspring, or whatever you want to call them, are actually the original date palm. The date palm was so important in the lives of ancient Israel that it is the only plant to be one of both the 7 species and the 4 species with which the land of Israel is blessed. And that's because it's so useful for so many things. You know, people would use it for everything from roofing material to seats to making mats. And it was also a sign of nearby water, so that it symbolizes the tree of life in many religious traditions.
What's really interesting about the date palm is that it can be watered with not 100% fresh water. It can have some salinization or some saltiness in the water. And also, I know, and you can tell me more about this, that throughout Israel, much of the watering of the date palm is done with gray water. Is that not true?
Well, I know that, a lot of it is done with saline water, with saline brackish water, because it is very tolerant to salt. And it would be logical also that it would be done with recycled water, because we recycle something like 80% of our grey water and sewage, and we use that in agriculture.
So do you remember the names of some of the other date palms, the resurrected seeds? Do you remember any of their names?
One of them she named after her son, Adam. She's got 6 sons, Elaine. There's also Judith, Hannah, I think Boaz, and I don't remember the names of the rest.
And you have tasted these dates, have you not?
I have. Yes, I have. Very few people have tasted them because obviously the kibbutz wants to keep hold of the patent. It's very pleasant. It's quite a small date. It's sweet. It's a very pleasant honey-like taste. It's drier than the medjool, but it really is very, very nice.
And so you have no idea if they will become commercially available in the near future, do you?
In the near future, I have no idea, but I'm sure that is the plan. And certainly, I'm sure it's the plan to plant them in the wild where it's suitable to plant them.
Right. As you said, it's so suited to the climate here in Israel. And of course, any who have gone to the Dead Sea have seen the huge groves of dates, but they're also really available around Keturah, which is close to Eilat, and in all of the Arava area as well. And I may add as well that since the massacre on October 7th, several groves have been planted in honor of these communities that were really decimated in the massacre. And so if you drive to the Dead Sea, you can see signs that this grove of olive trees is for Kibbutz Be'eri. It's such a meaningful tree to Israelis and to the land for sure. But let's move on to another plant that wasn't resurrected from ancient seeds, but goes through a form of resurrection on its own. And that's the Rose of Jericho. So tell us about this plant, Sue.
This is an extraordinary plant. I saw it actually first in the past year growing in the Arava, which is the extreme desert, extreme desert is around Keturah on the way down to Eilat. And it's apparently named after Jericho because Jericho constantly kind of reinvented itself and arose again and again from the ashes of destruction. And it's an extraordinary example of a plant that really survives against all the odds. Incredibly little rain, very, very barren landscape. And it looks like a closed fist. And the closed fist is actually the mother plant, which dies. And but it contains the seeds inside. And it can wait for a long, long time. It needs a minimum of 10 millimeters of rain. And when the rain comes, it causes the plant's dead tissue to swell, and it literally opens up like a hand to expose the seeds. And the seeds can then germinate, flower, and fruit. And then the whole process begins again. It's absolutely extraordinary. And, if you can actually buy Roses of Jericho in tourist shops in the Dead Sea and in the south, and you can put them in a bowl and add water, and you can actually see this process happening. So it's really cool.
Is this a one-time process, meaning you put it in the water, it opens up?
It's a one-time process for each plant, yeah. I mean, I've actually tried it. I think it actually works more than once because I've got a few at home and I have tried opening them. I think it happens more than once, but you get the idea doing it once. But in nature, it happens once, and then, the seeds fall out and they germinate and they make new plants, and then the mother plant dies and the seeds are enclosed inside again. So in nature, it happens just the once for that particular plant.
And does it have flowers, colorful flowers, or is it just this fist that opens and closes?
No, they're very small flowers, and one of the extraordinary things that it actually self-pollinates, so it's not reliant on insects or anything else.
Oh, that's so interesting. And just as an aside, there is a disease that is very prevalent in the desert area as well, where this flower, or I don't know what we're going to call it, this plant grows. It's called Rose of Jericho, Shoshanat Yericho. And it's a skin disease where you find little scabs. And now I understand a little bit more why it's called this, because obviously it is around the Jericho region, but it's called leishmanias in Latin, I guess that would be, but it forms this little crust of a circle that can open and close. And so perhaps that's related to this plant. Who knows? Yeah.
I wasn't aware of that.
So let's turn to a thorny subject, the Christ thorn tree, which is called shezaf in Hebrew. And in English, okay, Sue, you're going to have to correct me again because I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce this, but the Christ thorn jujube?
Yes, jujube, or Ziziphus spina Christi. This is named because the tradition says that the thorns from the tree, and it really has horrible thorns, were used for the thorns of Jesus. It's a very nasty tree, and the reason it's nasty is because it's very hard to get rid of. It spreads underground, and so if you try to cut it down, it'll just spring up somewhere else. It also steals water from other plants. And it's one of many, and there are over 100 plants mentioned in the Bible. And that's because obviously in those times, in ancient times, people lived on the land and with the land, and they knew the plants and the animals so much more intimately than we do today. And so the Bible often uses plants as symbols or metaphors or in parables for messages that God and his messengers want to convey. In the case of this particular plant, and it's a plant that many people will know who live on the lowlands, it has tiny little yellow fruits, which actually are edible and are eaten by animals and some humans. There's a story about Abimelech. Abimelech was a son of Gideon, one of the judges, and he was so nasty and so eager to grab the throne that he actually had his 70 brothers murdered, put to death on the same stone. But one of his younger brothers escaped. This was Yotam. And Yotam decided to warn the residents of Shechem against anointing Abimelech the king. And he did this in a parable. He climbed up to Mount Gerizim, which we know from the Samaritans, and he told the story of the trees searching for a king to rule over them. He approached the olive and the fig and the grape, but none of them were prepared to give up their productivity for power. But the thorn bush was. The thorn bush, however, made conditions, and it said that its new subjects had to come within its shade to prove their allegiance, and also that if they didn't come within its shade, it would burn all of those who didn't do so. In the end, people are, as we know, people don't always listen or they don't always understand, and the residents of Shechem ignored the advice. And the rule of Abimelech went ahead and ended in bloodshed. Anybody who knows this tree would understand the connection between the nasty tree and the nasty Abimelech.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but in Israel, there's some really ancient examples of this tree. Is that correct?
I'm not aware of ancient examples of this particular tree. There are very old examples of olive trees, for example.
So that's the perfect segue into our next item, which is olive trees, and specifically the wild olive. I mean, in my garden, I love olive trees. I think they're really the most beautiful tree in the world, and they're evergreens. And so it's just lovely to have them all year round. I have 5, actually. And what you wrote about earlier this year is the wild olive, which is actually, correct me if I'm wrong, pretty much dying out from the rest of the world. So tell us about the wild olive.
Yeah, the wild olive used to grow all around the Mediterranean coast until the Ice Age, and then very few places were left. Some on the Iberian Peninsula, and some in Israel, in the area of the Carmel. Now, the ones that live in Israel, a lot of research has been done, a lot of DNA research has been done into the olive trees here, and the vast majority of olives that grow in open space, and this is research done by the Volcani Institute, the vast majority are actually feral trees, which means that they escaped from orchards at some time or another, or were originally part of orchards. But the research seems to indicate now that there's a particular group of olive trees in and outside, mainly just outside of Atlit, which is a city south of Haifa on the coast. And these particular trees survive on kulkar. Kulkar is a kind of rock that's made of fossilized sand. And most of it's disappeared in Israel because it's been built upon. But there is a small area just outside of Atlit where these trees grow, but they're actually more like bushes. And they have this really funny shape. They're kind of almost trapezoid. And that's because they are right on the coast, and one of the theses is that they have survived because they're subject to the westerly winds from the sea into the salt spray, and this means that pollen, it's very, very difficult for pollen from cultivated trees to get anywhere near them because the wind would blow in the opposite direction. So you have this relatively small area of these very oddly shaped olive bushes come trees, which have very small fruits that don't yield very much oil. They're very low, and there is now a campaign to preserve them. And there will be more research to the north of Atlit and to the south of Atlit to see whether there's other wild olives growing on this very rare kulkar rock.
It's really interesting every year at the Seder, the Passover Seder, where you're supposed to eat the amount of matzah that is kazait, which is the size of an olive. And anyone living today knows that there are a gazillion million different sizes of olives. And it's fascinating to me as a person who does not like matzah, to hear that the olive of yore, back in the day, of course, you're talking about many thousands of years before the Passover Seder, the Haggadah was redacted, but to hear that they're very tiny seeds that actually don't yield a lot of oil, it makes sense that, of course, they've been bred, that the olive tree was bred to produce.
Exactly. Yes, olives have been around for a long time. I'd love to tell the story of Psalm 128. So the olive tree was always central to the economy of ancient Israel, together with wheat and grapes. And that troika, if you like, survives to this day in our religious traditions of drinking wine, lighting candles, and eating bread, which is common to the Jewish tradition and to the Christian tradition. It's a symbol of light, and that's partly to do with partly to do with the fact that its oil was used for lighting, but also to do with the fact that it's adapted to these very hot conditions here. If you look at an olive leaf, the underside actually has very fine white hairs on it, and that's to refract the sunlight back. And so it means that the olive loses less water in hot conditions. And so when an olive tree blows in the wind, it's actually almost like tinkling, sparkling lights. It's the official emblem of Israel. There are 2 olive strands on either side of the menorah. And one of my favorite Bible plant stories refers to Psalm 128. The psalm actually says, may your wife be like a fruitful vine within your house, and may your sons be like olive shoots around your table. Now, anybody who knows the olive tree, and obviously the ancient Israelites would have known it very well, knows that if it's left to its own devices, an olive tree will sprout suckers from its base. And if those suckers aren't pruned, then they will become woody and they will eventually wrap themselves around the tree, and they will eventually become the tree when the original tree gets too old and dies. And so in some senses, and this goes back to maybe eternal life, in some cases, in theory, an olive tree can live forever. When you see very old olive trees in places like the Garden of Gethsemane, you will see that it looks like they've got ropes wrapped around them, which is actually the origin is in these suckers. And so if you go back to the psalm, what it's actually saying is, may your sons take over from you when you die, and may they continue in your righteous ways.
That's astounding, and it gives so much depth to the meaning behind the words. Thank you so much for bringing that story.
Well, I have to say that there is something, so much of the Bible and so many of these references are rooted in this country, in the land of Israel, and in the agricultural calendar. So I always think, if we talk about the festivals, Passover is related to the harvesting of the barley, Shavuot to the harvesting of the wheat, and Sukkot to bringing in, it's really the last chance before the rains to bring in the fruits to live on during the winter. And when you live in this country, you're very, very aware of those links, which subsequently took on religious themes. So Shavuot is the receiving of the Torah, and Passover is the Exodus. But they're very much rooted in the land and in those and in that calendar.
We'll forgive you the pun of rooted in the land, but let's go on and finish off with another biblical story, which is, of course, the idea of the Garden of Eden and the forbidden fruit. So many artists, of course, depict it as an apple, but apples don't grow great throughout all of Israel. For example, in my garden, I can only plant one species of apple. It's called an Anna, because the climate and the humidity is just not suitable for apple trees. So is it even possible? Of course, the Garden of Eden wasn't necessarily in the land of Israel, right? But is it even possible that the fruit was an apple, Sue? What are you thinking?
Well, it's highly unlikely, because apples actually come from Kazakhstan, and the name of the original capital of Kazakhstan, Almaty, is actually connected with the apple. There are lots of theories about what the forbidden fruit was, because it's not defined in the Bible. But there are two theories about the apple, the inclusion of the apple. Well, there's probably actually more. One is that the Latin for apple is malus, and malus means apple, and it also means evil. So that's one theory. And the other one is that Western painters actually incorporated a lot of themes from Greek myths. And one of the most famous myths was connected to Hercules and the 12 tasks that he was given. And one of those tasks was to steal 3 golden apples from the Garden of Hesperides. So these golden apples made their way into Western paintings and into paintings about the Garden of Eden. And that might be also one of the sources for what is probably an unlikely story.
But one of the candidates that I've heard quite often being banted about is the fig tree. And figs actually grow marvelously in the land of Israel. Really, they too are volunteers. Often, even if you just drop a fig in your garden somewhere, you may find a fig tree sprouting from it. They grow so nicely in the land of Israel. I don't know. Do you have any stories about the fig tree, Sue, just to end us off?
Oh, I have stories. I have stories about so many plants. Well, the fig tree actually appears in the story about Amos. Amos was a fig tree plucker. He would pick the figs in the morning because that's when the worms were most unlikely to be inside the fruit. The fig is an extraordinary plant. There's something like 750 species, and for each species, there is its own pollinating wasp. And the pollinating wasp enters into the fig, lays its eggs, and these develop into larvae. And the larvae, of course, are the worms that we don't want to find when we pop a fig into our mouths. The fig tree gradually bears its fruits. And so it has been compared, as I remember, to the Torah, where you're constantly discovering more and more wisdoms. So there are many stories connected with the fig as well. And of course, it's a symbol of peace. We should all aspire to sit under our vine and fig tree in peace in our gardens.
Lovely. And just a bad joke to end us off. You know what's worse than finding a worm in your fig?
Go on.
Half a worm.
Absolutely. The truth of the matter is I have a fig tree and I'm never up early enough to pick them, so they just mature and fall off. Then I buy them in the supermarket.
Oh, that's a shame. So Sue, thank you so much for joining me today in this very unusual Friday Focus, very lighthearted and in tune with the festival week that we are finishing now.
It's a great pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. Please join us in another episode next week with Lazer Berman. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. Until next week, Shalom.